Hello, my name is John Arden. I'm very, very happy to be a part of this conference on happiness. This is especially relevant during this global pandemic. And so what I'm going to be talking about is how to survive and how to keep from getting unhappy during this, not only the restriction period, but also the post-COVID period, because many people will be experiencing lingering symptoms of COVID that we refer to as long COVID. And so the experience of life satisfaction that you all are investigating is incredibly relevant with regard to how we take care of ourselves, how we maintain health, and how we appreciate our lives. And we also know that your age has a lot to do with your capacity to engage in some kind of level of satisfaction. Older people, let's say middle-aged people, a little bit more able, as you well know because of your research, able to maintain a sense of life satisfaction and happiness versus those young people that miss out on many of the networking experiences, social experiences that we all love during that period of our teenage years and our 20s and early 30s and all that. So what I'm going to try to do is weave in some of those comments throughout the presentation. So it's a delight and an honor to be part of this conference.
Okay, thank you, John. So you can share your screen, probably.
Okay. Okay, and let's see. Okay, so what we're going to be focusing on for roughly the next 50 minutes or so are the factors that seem to be important from a foundational perspective. In other words, you need to practice these factors on a daily basis, no matter what's going on with you. If you're locked into your household, you can't get out and so on, you still need these 5 healthy factors that I've encoded in the mnemonic C's. No matter what language that you use, it's still the 5 healthy factors. What we do know is you need to plant and cultivate these seeds on a daily basis. Some people say, well, you know, I've got a couple of them in place and, you know, that should be okay. No, you need the 5 healthy factors that you engage in on a daily basis. And they are social connectiveness, and exercise, education, diet, and sleep. Now, the first one is rather paradoxical because what we're required to do to keep us all safe is some social distancing. Now, a good friend of mine has recommended, and I totally agree with him, that we should call it physical distancing, not social distancing. In other words, what we're doing right now is social connectedness. I'm seeing Uliana's face. She's seeing my face. We're connecting. She's nodding as I'm talking. There's a connectivity here that's so critical. So during this period of the pandemic and the post-pandemic, we still need to maintain and cultivate these social connective experiences. Exercise, and we'll get into all these in a little bit. What I mean by that is aerobic exercise, meaning get your heart pumping. Education, meaning learning about what you're curious about in the world. And in my case right now, I'm just reading a huge amount about the COVID virus and the immune system and everything. And it's actually stimulating and interesting and trying to make it useful. Diet, absolutely critical because you can undermine your immune system's stability if you maintain a very, very poor diet, as well as you have poor sleep architecture. So we're going to be talking about all these factors, and they all have neuroscience backing, so to speak, and also the field that I'm so infatuated with called psychoneuroimmunology, which is a fancy way of saying the interaction between the mind, the brain, and the immune system. All very, very important, as well as another important science called epigenetics, meaning how to turn on the genes you want turned on, how to turn off the genes you don't want on. And all these factors have epigenetic, psychoneurological, and a neuroscience research backing. And so just to put this in perspective, we know that some of our grandparents anticipated that we would be talking about how doing things in our lifestyle affects our bodies and our brains. Of course, 100 years ago, we had no idea about how this all worked. We just hypothesized how this worked. But more recently, Nobel laureates such as Eric Kandel and others like Roger Sperry have suggested that actually lifestyle has a huge effects on gene expression and the way that your brain operates. So Eric Kandel suggested that counseling, psychotherapy produces changes in gene expression that alter the strength of synaptic connections. In other words, what you think about, how you feel, what you do changes your gene expression. Very critical to the stability, let's say, of your capacity to generate happiness. And so with regard to epigenetics, just a few words about this. We had certainly about 20 years ago an international effort called the Human Genome Project. And we thought, you know, that, oh my God, we're going to probably have 100,000 genes. It turned out that we didn't discover 100,000 genes. We discovered roughly 24,000. Oh, well, wait a minute, 24,000. Well, there are other species that have only 24,000 genes, and one of them is a worm. So a worm has the same number of genes? Well, geez, maybe we ought to consider what a gene is. Well, a gene is a section of your DNA that codes for amino acids that later make protein. That's all what genes do. You don't have a gene for happiness. You don't have a gene for depression or anxiety or some diagnosis or some silliness like that. I mean, if that were the case, you'd think about worms going to psychiatric clinics for psychotherapy or something because they have panic disorder or schizophrenia. It's a stupid idea. Genes code for amino acids that later turn into protein. Well, how much of our DNA does that? 2%. That means 98% of our DNA is not are not genes. Well, we used to call it junk DNA, meaning that's a bunch of junk in there. The 2%, that's the important one. What I'm saying essentially is we have greater adaptability than a worm. A worm is almost all genes in their DNA. We have 98% that isn't related to genes. Well, actually, I shouldn't say isn't related. Of course it's related. It's related because it can help gene expression, meaning we are adaptable by our lifestyle. We basically change our DNA, or rather our gene expression by our lifestyle. That's the whole point here. And our telomeres, which also are comprised by non-coding DNA, used to be called junk DNA, changes because of our lifestyle. And so our telomeres are the caps on the ends of your chromosome. You want to get ill, you want COVID, you don't want to recover as quickly, shorten your telomeres quick. On the other hand, if you want to be healthy and be resistant and buoyant, resilient, and also recover or not get COVID, keep your telomeres strong. Lifestyle is the way to do it. And that's why we pay attention to these things that undermine our capacity to keep healthy. Well, as you can see in the list here, there are a number of things that actually make you a little bit more vulnerable. The first one, we just can't stop doing. That's aging. You can slow it down or you can speed it up. But all the other ones are very strongly affected by lifestyle. And as you can see, some of those are lifestyle factors. And so what we need is the 5 healthy factors, which are encoded in the seeds mnemonic that give you the foundation to be happy, life satisfaction, and so on. Okay, now a few words about the immune system, because we're so compelled to understand how the immune system is operating relative to COVID. But after COVID, we're certainly going to be paying attention to it. You certainly have an immune system in your body. We all know that. And we also know that there's a lot of immune cells in your gut. A little bit more about that when we talk about diet. But you also have an immune system in your brain. And so if you have chronic inflammation, which is really part of the sequela of symptoms or causal factors for long COVID, then what you have is depression and the feeling of unhappiness. In other words, not being able to generate happiness. And that's why people with COVID and long COVID have what they refer to as brain fog. Well, what is going on with this immune system in the brain? You have immune overreaction in your body, anywhere in your body. You're going to now turn on these immune cells. And specifically, we're talking about these glial cells that are called microglial. You have these 4 different types of glial cells. Microglial are your immune cells in the brain. They then can respond to pro-inflammatory cytokines by spitting out more of them. And so if you have long COVID and you don't climb out of the long COVID, meaning practice the 5 healthy factors, you could accelerate the propensity to develop dementia much more quickly than other people. That's the shocking part of what we're experiencing now as a world population here. So what we need to do is turn down chronic inflammation. Let me repeat that. COVID itself is related to what we call the cytokine storm. That's pro-inflammatory cytokines just blasting all over the place. And what we need to do is get the inflammation down. It's an overactive immune system. And chronic COVID, long COVID, is chronic inflammation, and we need to get it down. You have chronic inflammation, your capacity to generate happiness diminishes. You get lethargic. You can't generate positive thoughts. You get brain fog. And you just don't see any positive things going on around you. So what we need to do is get a handle on chronic inflammation. And we do know that all the research related to depression prior to COVID was centered around chronic inflammation. So isn't it interesting that after all these studies dating back to the late 1990s, up until roughly about a year ago, we were trying to target chronic inflammation to help with depression. And in fact, many of these drugs, these SSRIs, Prozac, and others, were actually seen to not just affect serotonin, but also act as anti-inflammatory agents. By the way, a lot of people, and I feel compelled to say this, are trying to fight COVID with antibiotics. It's not a bacteria unless you have a bacteria infection. You don't want to wipe out the bacteria of your gut. You'll have inflammation. And too much antibiotics does that. More about that a little later. What do we want to do? We want to get our thinking processes down. And there's no one thing called thought. There are many different mental operating networks that we have paid attention to. The last time I was honored to participate in your conference, I talked about these 3 operating networks that have these specific brain areas that generate the capacity for these fleeting states of mind. There's no one thing called mind. It's really states of mind that are jumping around. You know, as I'm looking at Uliana and she's looking at me, I could see that different states of mind are operative at any one particular time. You know, she might fade off thinking, well, you know, where are we going to go with this or whatever. I might think, oh, yes, so I might fade off in my default mode network because I'm not as centered and focused on the here and now. I might feel a little differently emotionally because my emotional network is sort of bogged down, perhaps with chronic inflammation. So we know that these brain networks are critically involved in the generation of these different types of thought. We'll talk a little bit about this in the end when we talk about mindfulness and contemplative practice and all that and the areas that associate with those. But we need to keep them in balance. And with COVID, we know that people have a tendency to be a little bit too much default mode network. In other words, they're not as here and now. It's hard for them to focus on the harder things to do, meaning be present and be goal directed, which has a lot to do with your capacity to generate happiness. So keeping these mental operating networks is part of what we refer to as mental health. And we also have a library of experiences that we code into our memory systems, and they're super complex. We could spend several hours just on the memory systems, but nevertheless, I just want to highlight that these mental operating networks derive their information from the library of coded information within our brain and body. Okay, now a little bit about how the brain hemispheres work with happiness or, on the other side, depression. We know that the 2 hemispheres generate emotions differently. People that tend to be more right hemisphere oriented, we know this related to a lot of anxiety research and depression research, they tend to be more into withdrawal patterns and avoidant patterns and tend to be more anxious and depressed. We know that trauma victims, for example, tend to withdraw, avoid, and get more these icky feelings of not only depression, but also anxiety. So what we also know through a lot of this evidence-based practice research related to psychotherapy is getting people doing things, engaged in life, activates the left prefrontal cortex and activates positive experiences. So in other words, avoidance and withdrawal generates negative emotions. Positive emotions are generated through activation and approach. And we know that people that are more depressed and less capable of happiness, let's say, or satisfaction, or more right hemisphere oriented. Left hemisphere relates to engagements in life. We'll talk about this again a little later when we talk about contemplative practices. But we could say that the left is better able to activate positive emotions and suppress happiness. And so what you could say to a client that you're working with, if you're a counselor, therapist, or whatever, is, you know, when you're overwhelmed with anxiety and depression, it's best to shift from the big picture. Remember, the right hemisphere is the big picture. Shift to a incremental piecemeal and climb yourself out of it. I'm going to do this and then do that, and small pictures. And then you climb out of the hole, so to speak. Now, it's very important to note that I'm not talking about shutting down the right hemisphere. I'm just talking about balancing it with the left hemisphere, because the right hemisphere is an important part of your brain, without a doubt. We're just talking about when you get skewed too much to avoid it in withdrawal. That's when you get unhappy. So, left hemisphere better able to generate feelings of life satisfaction. And if you're curious about anything, you explore it. And you're exploring it through your activation of your left prefrontal cortex. Whereas the right is more withdrawal, avoidance, and as a result, you end up feeling unhappy. Now, I want to say something about the very positive aspects of the right hemisphere before we lose it. I'm not saying it's not good. You know, let's take humor, for example. If you get your right hemisphere knocked out, you lose your sense of humor. So what the heck is humor? Humor is being able to stand back and sort of laugh at something. And the best type of humor you could possibly have, and these are people that are the most happy, are the people that can laugh at themselves in a liberating way. I don't mean make fun of yourself. Oh, I'm so terrible. No, I'm talking about find things funny. Find yourself funny. If you laugh at somebody else, that's not happiness. That's not humor. That's meanness. That's Donald Trump. So what we're talking about is being able to lighten up about yourself. It's incredibly liberating. And the right hemisphere gives you that capacity if you balance it out with activation of your left as well. Okay, so the seeds of happiness. Remember the 5 healthy factors. Social engagement. Why is this so important? Because we are a social creature. All of us on this planet, roughly before 11,000 years ago, we were hunter-gatherers. We moved around 10 miles a day, get kicked out of the group. You lose any sense of connectivity. You get eaten by a lion, but you also get super depressed. And so we know that there's a psychoneuroimmunology. In other words, there's an activation of your immune system that's really critical if you are socially connected. If you have isolation, if you are disconnected from people, if you feel that there's nobody that cares about you, your immune system goes flat. So very important when we talk about social distancing. Forget the social distancing, it's physical distancing, because we want to keep our sense of connectivity. And the best type of social connectivity that we possibly can have is the capacity to have empathy and compassion for one another. That is an antidepressant. And, you know, a lot of people get a sense of happiness by giving to other people. You actually generate happiness within yourself because there are areas of the brain that are very strongly involved with the capacity for empathy, like the anterior cingulate and others. Being able to give to others actually is a giving to yourself. So giving is really receiving. Those people that are selfish, that can't give to other people, actually experience unhappiness and they deplete their immune system. And we also shrink areas of the brain, like the temporoparietal junction, which is right here on the right side, intersection of the parietal and temporal lobe. You shrink that area with loneliness. Those of us in the helping healthcare professionals, especially mental health professionals, we're always exercising this area of the brain. It shrinks with loneliness. We also know that your capacity to generate these dopaminergic circuits, dopamine from your ventrotegmental area to anticipate any kind of positive experience, decreases with loneliness. So social connectiveness, very important for the feelings of life satisfaction. So let's move to exercise. So incredibly important to generate those networks in the brain. Remember, we move 10 miles a day. Well, who moves 10 miles a day right now? Well, not many people do that unless you're in a car or something like that. So we need to get our bodies adapted to what our bodies evolved to do. And we're not doing this right now. We're actually de-evolving. You know, we're now sitting around at these computers all the time, you know, and we're not moving. We're just stuffing our face with junk and everything else. So moving on a regular basis is actually anti-inflammatory. Remember, I was saying that one of the major factors related to COVID is chronic inflammation. Well, actually, you can activate anti-inflammatory cytokines, meaning anti-inflammation, through movement of your muscles, as well as your cardiovascular systems and all that. So as you can see, myokines are anti-inflammatory cytokines that get activated with the movement of your muscles. Now, one way to measure inflammation is through a protein that is released through various organs, including your liver. And so if you get a blood panel by your physician, oftentimes they're going to be checking C-reactive protein. And so C-reactive protein is a measure of inflammation. Now, look what happens with C-reactive protein with every increment of exercise. The more vigorous your exercise, more cardiovascular boosting of your exercise, the lower the inflammatory networks. Critically important, even if you don't feel like it. So we need to get people moving. And it's also related to your capacity to generate positive emotions, happiness. So exercise is actually the most powerful antidepressant that we have, and you don't stick it in a pill. And so there are multiple studies throughout the world that have demonstrated that exercise is the fundamental thing we want to get going with people that are depressed. Well, the capacity for happiness is dependent on whether or not we're doing this as well. And other networks that are critically important that we could spend, an hour on each. We talked about gene expression. There's also this magic organic fertilizer called brain-derived neurotrophic factor that is very involved in neurogenesis as well as neuroplasticity that gets released with exercise. Also, your capacity to use energy in the form of glucose through insulin-like growth factor, as well as other neurotropic factors that help your brain get rewired, so to speak, as well as keeping the capillaries in your brain, the little blood vessels, very flexible, so you don't have these little aneurysms all over the place. So VEGF, which is vascular endothelial growth factor, all of these factors improve with exercise. So you can have a happy brain, a brain capable of it. Okay, let's talk about education. So we know that the more you are educated, I don't mean necessarily fancy degrees, that's a way to structure your education. You can just constantly learn. I'm spending the COVID period just reading all this stuff about COVID now and finding it interesting and how the immune system works to get over it and everything else. Well, what I'm doing is connecting up neurons that weren't connected before. That's called synaptic plasticity. So you have roughly 100 billion neurons in the brain. There are roughly 10,000 connections with other neurons. The more connectivity you have, the more dense and capable of different appreciations for life around you. So meaning in a sense that the more subtleties that you can experience in a positive way, we also call that happiness. Because if you only derive your sense of happiness from one thing, you're stuck because you can't always get that one thing. Plus, by the way, I could spend a lot of time on these dopamine circuits and all that. You can't regenerate these dopamine receptor sites if you're only focused on that one thing. We also call it addiction. So earlier, about a couple months ago, I don't know, Uliana, if you were a part of the conference there in Lviv, but I talked about that, the addiction conference and the ability to recycle these dopamine circuits. So happiness and also the resistance to any kind of addiction necessitates that we derive pleasure from subtle interactions. So moderate levels of life appreciation is much better. So there's this term in Buddhism as a middle path, so to speak. Instead of I only get happiness in this one way, well, it requires a brain network capable of that. So that means you need to connect these different neurons to have this much more complex feeling of life appreciation. And so we're looking at how the brain adapts and new dendritic spines and everything as you learn. Critically important. And you have to get out of your comfort zone to be able to do that. So we know for roughly 100 years now, Yerkes and Dodson showed that you have to be uneasy to be able to remember stuff. In other words, just learning stuff you only know about because you like it doesn't build a brain that's capable of all these experiences. What you need to do is step out of your comfort zone to build a much more complex brain. In other words, you need to be a little uneasy. And building in these memory systems, and there are many different memory systems. Again, we could spend the entire day or many days just on the memory systems, because there are all these different types of memory systems: implicit, explicit, non-conscious, conscious, and so on. But I'm just covering all the seeds factors here. And the next one that I just want to touch on is diet. And that's the D, and it's essentially brain food here. And so we know that your ability to generate problem-solving capacities, in other words, what am I going to do in this limited situation? I can't go to the restaurant and meet my friends right now. I can't go around and do all the things I used to do. Like I'd love to fly over to Ukraine and travel around Eastern Europe. Nope, can't do that now. And neither can all you fly over here. We're in a shutdown. Okay, so what am I going to do? I need a problem-solving capacity. I need a brain network that's being fed with fuel that's capable of these kinds of nimble cognitive experiences, and at the same time be able to generate moods that are positive. That requires fuel that is balanced fuel, meaning your diet. And so unfortunately, we have been engaged in undermining our capacity for these brain networks in the standard Western diet. And we're now seeing actual shrinkage of the brain in particular areas because of the Western diet. And what I'm talking about with the Western diet is simple carbohydrates, fried food, and so on. And so you get all sorts of problems like, not only all the lifestyle diseases, metabolic syndrome, diabetes type 2 and all that, but also shrinkage of the left hippocampus, more negative cholesterol, low density cholesterol, and all that. And so the gut bacteria aspect to a diet is really very important as well, because here's where you can generate inflamed gut if your diet is imbalanced and not be able to get out of long COVID, or maybe get more vulnerable to COVID if your diet is all messed up. So in other words, if you feed the Firmicutes, that's a category of gut bacteria, by simple carbohydrates and fried foods and all that, and don't maintain the Mediterranean diet, you're going to have an inflamed gut, have more fat cells, more propensity to develop diabetes type 2, cardiovascular disease, and all that. Or minimize the amount of Bacteroides that is really part of what lean people generate, because they're eating more fruits and vegetables. And so what we want to do is lean towards the Mediterranean diet, minimize the standard Western diet of processed foods and all that. By the way, I want to also, I feel compelled to talk about antibiotics. Antibiotics wipes out all gut bacteria. You don't want to be doing that. And if you do have to take it because you have an infection, not a virus. Antibiotics don't kill viruses. But if you have an infection, like I had pneumonia once, and it was bacterial pneumonia, I had to blast it with antibiotics, but I had to build up through building up my gut bacteria again with all the phytonutrients to build in a plethora of different positive gut bacteria, meaning the Bacteroides. Otherwise, I'm going to get a leaky gut because I have too much of pro-inflammatory cytokine activity going on. And that turns on the inflammation in your brain. Remember that superhighway we were talking about before. And so what we don't want to do is keep this negative cycle going, because you get brain fog. And diet is a big part of this picture. Minimize simple carbohydrates, saturated fat, and all that. Get out and exercise instead of sit around thinking you're too tired for it, because this cornucopia of brain nutrients is critical for your brain, including all these neurotransmitters that are made in your gut via the amino acids that you take in through your diet. So let us move on to the last of the seeds factors by just summarizing the importance of a balanced diet. And now let's talk about how sleep is critically important for your immune system. During your sleep hours, you're actually generating more immune system activity, assuming that you maintain a good circadian rhythm. And so we really need to keep a very healthy circadian rhythm, meaning go to sleep at the same time almost every night and get up at the same time almost and a lot of it has to do with light and the capacity to generate light through your suprachiasmatic area in your brain. So you pick up light through your optic nerve and so on. So we want to maintain good sleep architecture. And so sleep is not just one thing. You want good slow wave sleep. You see the dark bands at the top, that's rapid eye movement sleep. As you can see, it's more packed towards the end of your sleep cycle. Slow wave sleep more in the early part of your sleep cycle, and that's when your immune system gets bolstered. If you don't get it early on, you end up groggy later in the day, we're actually in the morning and throughout the day. So slow wave sleep, very different from REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep. You can see REM sleep is very much like what we're generating right now as you go through those mental operating networks, including your default mode network. You're more likely to generate the same kind of brain activity as you do with REM sleep. As you can see, it's much more rapid. And so unfortunately, what we're doing right now is we're blocking a lot of, in the Western world, blocking a lot of our slow wave sleep by additives. People are taking over-the-counter drugs or prescribed drugs to get, quote, sleep, but it's really not good quality sleep. Benzodiazepines, the garbage of our healthcare system. Also, Benadryl-like substances, garbage. You want dementia quick? Block your slow wave sleep. You want not to get out of the COVID syndrome? Block your slow wave sleep, because there's a brain clearing process that also occurs, as well as activating your immune system when you need to activate it. Otherwise, you're going to be more fatigued, have brain fog, and more depression, incapable of generating happiness. And so what happens during slow wave sleep is there are these little pulses that clear out all these builds up of these various proteins like beta amyloid and others. So the slow wave sleep is like a washing machine, clearing out your brain of all these substances that can build up, like tau protein, beta amyloid, and all that are the hallmarks of Alzheimer's later on in life. So we know that people that take these additives for sleep actually are more prone to get Alzheimer's disease later in life, but also depression, incapable of generating happiness. And so what we eat has a big effect on what level of sleep architecture you're able to generate. And a few other things about sleep that I want to note is that body temperature is critically important. You want to keep a cool body temperature throughout the evening. Sure, you can get to sleep with a nice duvet or quilt or whatever, but you're not going to be able to generate that deep sleep that I was talking about before. So crack the window open, keep your blankets lighter, very important to be able to maintain that sleep architecture. Otherwise, you're going to wake up not feeling as peppy and positive and generating happiness and all that. So very important that you maintain all these factors simultaneously to be able to generate good quality sleep. And just to summarize again, the 5 healthy factors that need to be in place every single day are the ones I just went over. They are the foundation for happiness, the foundation for actually physical health, because physical health has a huge amount to do with mental health. Okay, much of what I talked about is in the book Mind, Brain, Gene, that relates to the immune system, epigenetics, and all the factors that we just talked about. If you want to email me, my email address is at the top of the slide here. My website is below, and I'm certainly open to any questions or comments. Uliana, can you think of anything that I might have missed, or anything that you thought should be covered?
Well, thank you very much, John. It was extremely interesting, and I'm sure that would be extremely useful as well for all the participants of the conference and everyone who will be interested in the topic. So at the moment, I have just some questions not related to the subject of your lecture, but about your personal psychological and psychiatric practice. So when people come to see you, do they come with a question or problem as I'm not feeling happy, I cannot get happiness, or whether happiness is not an issue at all? Maybe people address with other problems and they think of other problems and they do not focus on happiness at all. So what are your personal observation from your practice?
So the term they would often use is unhappiness. So instead of saying I'm not happy, some do, but often people say I'm unhappy, or I'm just, life is not what it used to be. I just can't, nothing seems to really make me feel good anymore. Things seem so bleak. I mean, these are different ways of saying the same thing. They don't necessarily say, I'm coming in to talk to you about happiness. But what they're talking about is all the factors that relate to happiness on the other side. In other words, incapable of it. And so after really, God, I was thinking, I've been in the mental health practice longer than Uliana, you've been alive. So I've been in practice for over 40 years. And so, God, I've seen a lot, like a lot of people that are participating, I'm sure, have as well. But, I think it's really important for us to bring things down to earth for our clients, and to help our clients understand rather than make it esoteric. Do I get into talking about myokines and pro-inflammatory cytokines and use all that terminology with my clients when they're coming in and saying I'm unhappy? No, I try to keep it really, really simple. Because if they're depressed and unhappy, they're not going to remember stuff like pro-inflammatory cytokines. They're just going to remember things like seeds and just say that you need the chemistry, the brain networks to be able to generate a foundation for happiness. And if you are undermining it, like building a house on sand, any little shake, like we have more earthquakes over here in the Western United States than you do in Ukraine, then your whole house is going to crumble down. And so what we don't want to do is build a house on sand. You need a foundation to be able to generate happiness. And how do you do that? You notice I didn't say anything about all these brain networks or use all these technical terms. Just keep it simple. So over the years, I try to appeal to where the person, where their cognitive ability is at and what they're capable of thinking at that time. And so that's one of the reasons for the seeds mnemonic, just to keep it somewhat simple.
And what can you say about people and people's mental health in case when some people never thought of or haven't thought yet about whether they are happy or not?
Well, I introduced the topic, but I also note something that I think is very important. I'm sure that you know about this, and that is the state of happiness is not a constant experience. We have fleeting periods of happiness. And sometimes people that are suffering from ill mental, not, I don't want to use the medical model because I'm really against it, but not so good mental health, let's say, have a feeling or a thought that they need to feel happy all the time. Well, who feels happy all the time? Your moods are always fluctuating. And we have these periods of feeling better, feeling a little less better, and all that. So if they can understand that happiness is not a constant. Remember this mental operating networks that we talked about before. Well, you're constantly revolving around them. Even if you're, super into mindfulness meditation and all that, all the people that are researching mindfulness and especially compassion-based mindfulness are talking about the periods of fluctuating thoughts and feelings. And so to answer your question, as long as people understand that there's not a constant feeling of happiness, but rather a waviness to it and subtle experiences of life appreciation, we can also call happiness. There is no surge. I mean, then you get into these addictive modes with these dopamine circuits and all that. You can't maintain that. And so it's the middle path of subtle appreciation that is really, I think, the hallmark of the capacity to maintain, let's call it happiness.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And one more question and actually observation as well that I would like to share with you is concerns our research, the research of our team, which we made last year. And that was the research on the impact of COVID quarantine restrictions on people's happiness. So what we have found out is that the group of people over 45 years, from 45 till 60, around this age, have more sustainable happiness, which doesn't depend on some external factors and is not decreased easily by external circumstances. So even though they had lower income and some definitely discomfort due to quarantine restrictions, but they still report being happy, remaining happy. And when it comes to a group of young people, 18, 22 years old, this group was the most vulnerable. Their happiness was the most vulnerable to external circumstances. So we assume as well that the reason might be the difference in values between these two groups. So like happiness is defined by different things by these people, but maybe you can add something from psychiatric, psychological, or neuropsychological aspect.
Sure, yeah, and what your research makes a whole lot of sense. I mean, that's what I would anticipate, that people that are middle-aged and above, providing they have a fairly good foundation, are able to generate happiness, or let's say life satisfaction, because they're able to also appreciate subtleties in their environment, but also delay gratification too. And so what is that all about? It's about the prefrontal cortex. So when you talked about 18 to 22, well, actually, we do know that the prefrontal cortex isn't totally myelinated until the mid-20s for women and even later for men. And so the capacity to delay gratification is really a big part of prefrontal cortex development. And so, when you talked about that, I was thinking, geez, that certainly makes a whole lot of sense. I was even thinking about what I would experience if I was, let's say, 22, and that's at the top end of your band of 4 years. Well, when I was 22, I was traveling around the world through Asia and the Middle East, and came back when I was 23. And I can't do that. I couldn't do that stuff during COVID. And wow, that is a major, and I can't go hang out with friends and do all these things and everything else. Plus, it's really difficult if I'm a 18 to 22-year-old to delay gratification. You know, my life has been relatively shorter, so I can't really think, well, things will get better over a period of time because, you know, things are so immediate. And so it would certainly make sense developmentally that people who are in that age group are more heavily impacted by the shutdown. You know, here's some other aspects that I think really unfortunate that can unbundle the seeds. I'm thinking about sleep. Well, we have a social interaction we need to have in place. Well, we're now requiring ourselves to connect. If you're managing social distancing without the social distance part, but with the physical distance, you're on the computer, you're looking at light, you're diminishing your capacity to create sleep architecture by using the computer late at night. We need the computer. That's what we're using right now. So a lot of young people are utilizing social media for that purpose. But you know what? I want them to use it. Use it whatever you, in whatever way you can, but don't do it late at night.
Okay, thank you very much, John, and thank you for your contribution to the conference, for those interesting ideas you shared with us, and thank you for being a part of the project, because indeed the mission of the project and the mission of the conference is to popularize knowledge of happiness and to show people how to apply this knowledge into their daily practice. Because indeed, the knowledge of happiness shouldn't remain some kind of esoteric knowledge, only belonging to a group of scientists who speak their language, but become like well-known for everyone, because that is the recipe for a long and healthy life. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, and thank you for what you're doing. I think that you are doing the world a service by your research and having conferences like this, and it's a great honor to be part of it.
Thank you very much.